Well, thank you, Kurt, and thank you, friends, for your generous hearts and spirits as we enter this season with generosity. Welcome here. If you are guests with us or if you're visiting, my name is Paul, and I have the honor of being the lead pastor here at Lakeview. And today, we step into the season of Advent. Now, some of you may have come from Christian traditions that don't formally observe Advent, or you really might not have even heard about it before. You simply kind of consider this time as the Christmas season time, the holiday season time that leads to Christmas. And that's completely understandable and fine, but we welcome you here. But today, as you come with the understanding of Advent, or maybe hearing it for the first time, today I want to invite you into this rich and important ancient rhythm. Because Advent is where Christian calendar, the Christian year, actually begins. It begins with Advent. It doesn't start with a celebration of Christmas morning, but right here, right in the slow and deliberate work of waiting, in the honest season of longing, when days are kind of a little too dark and a little too cold, and the light takes a little too long to show up in the morning and goes away very quickly. Advent begins right there, right in the honesty of the season, right in the darkness and the cloudiness and the the loneliness that Advent or this time in December could feel like. Advent shows up right in that time. Now, have you ever had one of those nights where you wake up at 3 a.m. and you just can't fall back asleep? Like you're up and you don't know why? You seem to have been sleeping well, but suddenly you're just wide awake for no good reason. Like nothing's urgent or really even dramatic. The house is quiet, the world is asleep, and yet your mind is just buzzing and you're wide awake. So you stare at the ceiling, you flip the pillow to the cool side, you try breathing deeply, counting backwards, you try praying, you start bargaining, but somehow the stillness of the night just starts pulling every worry to the surface. All the undone things, all the conversations you wish you had that have gone differently, all the questions that still don't have answers. And for some reason, that one thing you said in high school, like way back 28 years ago, is now front and center at 3 a.m. on your mind. And you're like, why? Why am I thinking about this? The things you can't ignore in the daylight, or the things you can ignore in the daylight, suddenly sit right beside you in the dark. And you just can't shake it. There's something about those hours of the night before the sun rises, before the world, restarts, that actually expose our real lives, our real longings, and our real weariness. Or maybe you don't relate of getting up in the middle of the night. You're like, I'm a great sleeper. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what your problem is. I sleep well. Fantastic. You're an amazing person, and I'd like to learn your secret, how to do that. But so maybe that metaphor doesn't suit you. But living in Saskatchewan, most of us know the feeling of the long drive, right? Like coming from work, especially in this season of December, the icy roads, it's dark. Circle Drive is just piled up with cars in the ditch and on the road, and it's just taking forever to get home. Or maybe you're driving from college, you're coming home to see family, or you're going from home to see your family somewhere away for holidays. Or maybe it's that common drive from Saskatoon to Edmonton and Edmonton to Saskatoon that a lot of people do. You're driving back from Edmonton, you just watched the Oilers lose again. And I wasn't sure if you guys are going to laugh at that. It was a little bit of a gamble there. But you're driving home, you're not happy, and it starts blizzarding, and you're on the road for hours, watching desperately, looking like through the horizon, through the snow, counting the miles, and you're not where you were, but you're not quite home yet either. And that in-between stretch can feel like it goes on forever and ever, and it's just so weary. Advent is the long drive home. Advent is the long drive home in the Christian story. It reminds us that we all live between the promise and fulfillment, between what God has spoken and what we are still aching to see. And that it's in that in-between is where most of us actually live our everyday lives. And Advent meets us there right in that moment, in our reality, in our hopes, in our sorrows, in our yes, and in our not yet. Not in triumph, not in clarity, not in everything's going to be fine, don't worry about it, optimism. Advent is for those long drives. Advent is for the 3 a.m. people, the ones laying awake in the dark, carried by longing, fear, or hope they can barely articulate. Advent invites us to be honest about what feels heavy and weary. Simply put, Advent begins with honesty. To name what is unfinished, to recognize the ache we all carry, and right there in the middle of our real imperfect lives, we are reminded of the God story that speaks joy even into our weary hearts. And so today we step into this season with our Advent series, Weary World Rejoices. And in the Advent devotional by the same name, by Kate Bowler, which inspired this series, Kate reflects that she loves the biblical prophets. Like she starts out her devotional, she starts this book out in a way for us as she talks about Advent. She says, I love the prophets because they are so honest. They refuse to dodge the hard stuff. They tell the truth about the world with courage, compassion. They name what is broken plainly. They name it honestly. But as I sat with her words, as I was reading this devotional, as I was thinking of our series and praying through it, and I sat with her words as her naming that, I realized that I arrive at the same conclusion with her, but I take maybe more a roundabout way, more of a winding path to get there. Because for me, if I'm honest, the biblical prophets can actually feel overwhelming and confusing. Their imagery can feel tangled at times. Their timelines are disorientating. Their language thick with symbolism and metaphors, and at times, it's all just really too hard to follow. And without knowing the full context, we can get lost in what are they even talking about? What is happening? How does this relate to me? And one of the things that also bothers me about the prophets is they actually refuse to give us this neat version of faith that just tell me what faith is like, put it in this little box, and I can understand it. And the prophets don't really do that either. So it can feel all really overwhelming. But in the end, I still do come to the same conclusion. Because despite prophets and their overwhelming and their confusing ways, they do tell the truth. They name the pain, the injustice, and the heartbreak. And yet at the same time, they dare to imagine a future only God could bring. Now, not many of the biblical prophets do this quite like Jeremiah. In fact, he's known in our Bible as the weeping prophet, who sees the world through tears because of his particular context through which he understands how far the world is from what God intended. Let's read a passage from Jeremiah 33. He writes, "The day will come, says the Lord, when I will do for Israel and Judah all the good things I have promised them. In those days, at that time, I will raise up a righteous descendant from King David's line, and he will do what is just and right throughout the land. In that day, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will live in safety. And this will be its name: the Lord is our righteousness." Now, Jeremiah was a prophet who understood the harsh reality of life. Now, he's not writing these prophetic words with like this one day, the days are coming. He's not writing it from, quiet retreat center or at a cafe as he's preparing this message while enjoying a latte. He's not writing from the comforts of life to tell someone out there that things will just get better. Just hang tight. No, he's writing from prison. The city has fallen. Babylon has crushed Jerusalem. The world, as he knows it, has collapsed. And Jeremiah doesn't offer any niceties. No quick fixes. No, everything happens for a reason, folks. It's all right. Instead, he roots his understanding of reality in the promise and the story of God. From his place of sorrow, he lifts his eyes and imagines a future shaped by the promises of God. He introduces to us a prophetic imagination. In these few verses, Jeremiah is pulling together the great covenants of Scripture, right? He's talking about the promise to Noah, about the remnant, that it will withstand, that it will remain. He's talking about the blessing to Abraham, that he will have many children. He's talking about the calling of Israel through Moses, the kingdom promised through David, and even the new covenant he himself speaks just a few chapters earlier. He reminds the people with all of his prophetic imagination that all of God's promises are moving somewhere. Jeremiah teaches us something we all desperately need in seasons like Advent: to hold to two truths at the same time. Truths that seem to live in tension but actually belong together. Now, in his passage, we're introduced to these two truths, and the first truth is simple acknowledgement that the world is not as it should be. I mean, I don't have to tell us that. We just have to turn on the news. The world is not as it should be. And the prophets, they never pretend. They don't say, well, that's okay, God will work things out, and this happens for God's good, or however we justify things. The prophets don't pretend. They name the injustice. They name the pain. They name the longing and the loss. And they give us permission to tell the truth about what is broken, both out there in the world, but also inside our own hearts. They allow us the truth to name what is not right in our hearts. And the thing about the prophet is this: they refuse to let us numb ourselves. They won't let us paper over the ache or distance ourselves with noise. They insist on honest speech. Because only when we name what's wrong can we make space for God. Can I say that again? Because only when we name what's wrong can we make space for God. The prophets teach us the courage of lament. They show us that bringing our grief to God isn't weakness, it's a doorway for renewal. When we allow ourselves to grieve, to sit with what is hard, we create room for God to meet us in ways we would otherwise miss. So they don't stop at naming what's broken. They don't stop at naming what's broken, and though that they help us imagine instead. They don't stop at saying, well, things are just broken, they're just broken. They actually build an imagination for us to see what do we do from there. They open our eyes to a future we can't yet fully see. A future shaped not by fear or despair, but by God's justice, mercy, and unfailing love. So the first truth is they name the world is not as it should be. But the second truth they help us hold in balance with that is that God's promise is already on the way. Even in the middle of our mess, the prophets insist that new future is being born. A future God is already shaping. And they help us see the present honestly and the future hopefully. And that's the tension of Advent, right? We name what is broken, and at the same time we hope and we trust that God is already at work mending what we simply cannot. And honestly, when things are too dark and too hard and too cold, don't we need that reminder that yes, things are not as they should be, but that God is doing a good work? Because we live in a world that keeps trying to sell us an opposite story. The world keeps telling us a story that if we hustle harder, that if we're just a little bit smarter, if we can curate this perfect mindset, we can fix everything just on our own. And of course, it doesn't work. And Jeremiah pushes back on that reality. He reminds us that sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is simply tell the truth and say, this is not right. And this is why in Advent, in our waiting, we say the truth and then move toward hope. We light candles, and we don't light to pretend that darkness isn't real. We light the first candle to declare that darkness does not get the final word, that despite its reality, we have hope. We light it to proclaim that even in the now and not yet of our lives, the light is coming, and that even a small flame, as fragile as it may seem, is enough to push back the darkness. Now, it is right here in that tension between those two truths that the world is not as it should be and God's promise is already on the way, that Jeremiah's prophetic imagination opens up space for hope. This hope dares to envision a world shaped not by what we see right now, but by the promises of God, by the story of God. So what are the hopes that we can see in Jeremiah's small passage that we read? Well, in his declaration that the day is coming, we first see that Jeremiah introduces us to the hope, a hope that hope is something we share. Jeremiah refuses a private, individualized hope. He speaks to a people, reminding them and calling them to hold hope together and not apart. Because in Scripture, hope is always communal. It's something we carry for one another, with one another. It is shared trust that God's future is more real than our present pain. And you know what that's like, right? During the prairie blizzard that I keep talking about and our visual kind of cues to, Visibility drops to zero, the wind cuts straight through, the roads turn to ice, and being outside feels genuinely dangerous. But then, the storm fades or settles. When the wind dies down and you step outside and the drifts are piled high and the neighborhood is covered in wreckage, something beautiful begins to happen. A neighbor starts shoveling their sidewalk, but they don't end there. They keep going towards your sidewalk. Someone pushes a car that's stuck in the end of the street. Another person comes out with booster cables. Someone checks on the elderly couple down the block. It's instinctive. It's communal. It's the Advent hope. Not pretending the cold isn't real or acting like the storm never swept through. It's a posture, a generous imagination that moves us in the world that says, yes, there is wreckage from the storm, but here's how it ought to be. A way of showing up for one another, a way of choosing compassion over isolation, a way of practicing, even in small ways, the world that God is making new. Advent hope doesn't deny the storm. It simply refuses to let anyone walk through it alone. And then not only is hope something we share, Jeremiah's prophetic imagination then reminds us that hope is something we see. Jeremiah dares to believe it. He stands in the dungeon in the rubble of Jerusalem and insists that the world will be made right. That God's future is one of justice and compassion and wholeness. The righteousness will flourish not as an idea, but as a way of life. And that God is already bending the story in that direction. Jeremiah has this prophetic imagination that God is already, through all his covenants and all his promises, despite the rubble, despite the occupation and exile, that God is bending the story in that direction. Jeremiah helps us in this season of Advent to train our eyes to look toward the future, to watch the horizon as we journey home. He teaches us to look long and steady, even when all we can see is the faintest, tiniest flicker of hope. We lament honestly, and then we dare to imagine again, and we hope. We keep watch. We wait with expectation. We refuse to assume that what we see right now is all there ever will be. Just like neighbors stepping out after a storm looking for where help is needed, where kindness can break through and cold and warmth can be shared, the season and the rhythm of Advent can help form us into a people who look for the world God is making, who begin living that world now on earth as it is in heaven. It trains us to resist the script of fear, scarcity, and resignation that our culture hands us. Advent, in our waiting and longing, invites us to inhabit a different story, a God story, even before we see it in its fullness. It teaches us that hope isn't passive, that hope is a way of life. We start practicing the future God has promised, justice in the world of injustice, mercy in the world of anger, generosity in the world of grasping, peace in the world plagued with anxiety. Advent shapes us into people who live as if God's new world is already breaking in, because it is. And so we see it and we embody the future now, trusting that the one who promised is already at work and is making all things new. And then because of that, hope is something we nurture, something we hold for one another as we wait together. Jeremiah stands in the rubble and says, the days are coming. The days are coming when God will finish what he started. The days are coming when righteousness will reign, when peace will flourish, when all of God's promises will be fulfilled in Jesus. Long before Jesus was born, Jeremiah is pointing towards him. He's seen the God story. He's hoping, he's seeing, and he's nurturing. This is the promise Jeremiah held and nurtured, that the God who created the world would one day restore it all. And that is exactly what Advent season invites us into right now. Not to pretend that everything's fine, to put on a fake smile, not to silence our grief or ignore what feels unfinished, rather to tell the truth about our lives, to tell the inconvenient truths, the complicated ones, the ones we usually try to outrun or hide or are ashamed of. Advent invites us to see the world the way Jeremiah saw it, through honest tears, with hopeful eyes fixed on God who keeps his promises. So Jeremiah reminds us that Advent people hold two realities at the same time, right? The first, the world is not as it should be. Jeremiah doesn't look away from the rubble of his day, and neither should we. Advent begins in the dark. We tell the truth. We acknowledge the storm, the worry, the ache, the waiting. There's an honest lament that's actually part of our worship. And the second reality and truth is God's future is already on the way. Even in the night, Jeremiah hears God say, I will raise up a righteous descendant from the King David's line. A promise that's whispered into the darkness. Hope isn't the absence of pain. Hope is the arrival of God in the very middle of it. Can I say that again? Hope isn't the absence of pain. Hope is the arrival of God in the very middle of it. And holding these two realities together gives rise to the three hopes Jeremiah wants us to see. Hope is something we share. It's not a solo project. We carry one another. We remind one another. We hold hope for each other because it's hard to hold it alone. Hope is something we see, not because everything's fixed, but because we train our eyes to notice a small dawn breaking in the distance. A promise, a mercy, a kindness, little signs of the world God is bringing. And finally, hope is something we nurture. We tend it like a small flame. We protect it in community. We feed it with prayer, with scripture, with courage, with one another. And as we do, it grows. So Advent invites us to live right in the middle of these two truths, with the world as not as it should be, and the future God is already creating and on his way. And we share hope, we see hope, we nurture hope until the day his light fills the whole world. And that all sounds nice. I recognize that. And then you can talk about it and be like, yeah, hope, I need this hope. And I know things aren't right. And I know we're in this like in between that God is doing stuff, but things are not as they should be. And yes, there's a hope that we need to share and to see and to nurture. But really, like, so what? Right? Like, or now what? Like, what do I do with this? Can I suggest as we go from here, as we experience these tensions and these hopes, can I invite you into just a few small acts this week? Maybe just one of these. I'm going to name 4, but maybe just one of them. Maybe this week, choose one small act that says the world isn't as it is, as it should be, sorry, and that's exactly why I'm living towards God's promised future. Maybe try this week praying honestly instead of pretending you're fine. Like to actually lift that prayer up to God. Maybe share it with a friend that you trust. And not pretend that everything's okay, but just pray about things that are not right in the world or in your own heart. And then, or maybe secondly, check in on someone who's hurting. You've been praying for somebody, you've heard about them, and you know something's going on in their life. Maybe just that one small act of just checking in on them. Or maybe choosing forgiveness where resentment feels so much easier. Or maybe better said, where resentment is actually like, maybe it's in some ways appropriate response. But to choose to forgive and offer grace instead of allowing resentment to grow and grow. Or maybe finally just turning off the noise, putting away your phone, turning off the social media or TV or laptop, and sitting with God for just even 5 minutes in complete silence. Recognizing the world is not as it should be, but also knowing that his future is already arriving. They're small things, they're quiet things, acts that seem almost insignificant in some ways. And yet these are precisely the places where hope begins to take root, in the honest, aching spaces of our lives. It's here that we dare to live toward the world God has promised even before we fully see it. Now, these small acts don't ignore the pain or minimize the ache. They choose hope right in the midst of it. And hope is one of the deepest acts of faith, if I can suggest that. Walter Brueggemann, a theologian and author, reminds us that hope is an act of defiance. An act of defiance. For Jeremiah, this defiance comes out as he imagines an alternative world that God is birthing, even when the dominant reality says there's no future. You're in prison and Jerusalem's destroyed. Hope pushes back that darkness. Hope refuses to settle for the way things are. Hope insists that God is not finished yet, that God is with us. And friends, That is why a weary world can still rejoice.